I still remember the sound of rain against my kitchen window that October morning in Portland, Oregon. The droplets traced lazy paths down the glass while I stood there, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the gray clouds settle over the Cascade Mountains in the distance. It was one of those Pacific Northwest mornings where the world felt wrapped in cotton, muffled and peaceful. I had moved to this quiet neighborhood in southeast Portland 6 months earlier, seeking exactly this kind of solitude after my divorce. The small craftsman house with its overgrown garden felt like a refuge from the chaos my life had become. But that morning, something was different. Through the rain-blurred window, I noticed movement in my backyard. At first, I thought it was just the wind stirring the tall grass I'd been meaning to cut. Then I saw him clearly. A medium-sized dog soaked to the bone, digging frantically near my back fence. His coat, darkened by rain, looked like it might have been golden or light brown when dry. Every few seconds he would pause, look around nervously, then return to his digging with desperate intensity. I set my coffee down and stepped closer to the window. The dog was thin, too thin. His ribs were visible through his wet fur, and the way he moved suggested he'd been on his own for a while. But there was something else about him, something in his posture that spoke of a gentleness that hadn't been broken despite whatever hardships he'd endured. Without really thinking about it, I found myself putting on my rain jacket and stepping out into the drizzle. The dog heard the screen door close and froze, his entire body tensing as he turned to look at me. His eyes, deep brown and intelligent, held a mixture of fear and hope that hit me square in the chest. We stared at each other across the 20 feet of soggy grass, both of us perfectly still except for the rain pattering against the leaves above us. "Hey there, buddy," I said softly, crouching down to make myself less intimidating. "What are you looking for?" He didn't run, which surprised me. Instead, he sat back on his haunches and tilted his head, studying me with those remarkable eyes. There was something almost human in his expression, as if he was trying to decide whether I was someone he could trust. His tail gave the smallest of wags, barely perceptible, but there. I took a slow step forward, then another. The dog remained still, watching my every movement. When I was about 10 feet away, I could see him more clearly. He was beautiful despite his bedraggled state, definitely a golden retriever mix, probably with some lab. His face had the gentle, noble expression that made these breeds such beloved family dogs, but it was his eyes that captured me completely. They held a depth of intelligence and emotion that seemed almost inappropriate for an animal. "You hungry, boy?" I asked, still keeping my voice low and soothing. At the word hungry, his ears perked up noticeably, and his tail wagged more enthusiastically. That decided it for me. I backed slowly toward the house, maintaining eye contact, and gestured for him to follow. To my amazement, he did, staying about 10 feet behind me but definitely following. Inside, I searched through my sparse pantry. I hadn't owned a dog since childhood, so I had no dog food, but I found some leftover rotisserie chicken in the refrigerator. I pulled off pieces of meat, put them in a bowl, and added some water in another. When I returned to the back porch, the dog was sitting exactly where I'd left him, still in the rain, waiting. I set the bowls down on the covered porch and stepped back. The dog approached cautiously, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the chicken. But even in his obvious hunger, he maintained a careful dignity, eating slowly and looking up at me frequently, as if checking that it was really okay. As he ate, I studied him more carefully. Despite his current condition, this had clearly been someone's beloved pet. His coat, though dirty and matted, showed signs of having been well cared for. His nails weren't overgrown, and there was a lighter patch around his neck where a collar had recently been. Someone had loved this dog, and loved him well. "Where did you come from, buddy?" I murmured, more to myself than to him. He finished the chicken and moved to the water bowl, drinking deeply. When he was done, he sat back and looked at me again with that penetrating gaze. Then, to my surprise, he walked over to where I was sitting on the porch steps, and gently placed his head on my knee. The simple gesture nearly undid me. It had been so long since I'd felt that kind of unconditional trust, that immediate and pure connection. My marriage had ended in bitter arguments and lawyers' fees. My relationship with my parents had been strained for years over choices they didn't understand. I'd moved to Portland partly to escape the judgment and disappointed looks, to start fresh where nobody knew about my failures. But this dog, this stranger, offered his trust as simply as breathing. I reached out slowly and touched his head, running my fingers through his damp fur. He leaned into the touch, his eyes closing briefly in contentment. His fur was softer than it looked, and underneath the dirt and tangles, I could feel the solid warmth of a fundamentally healthy animal. "We need to find your family," I told him quietly. "Someone must be looking for you." He looked up at me as if he understood every word, his expression serious and attentive. Then he did something that made my heart skip. He placed his paw on my arm, a deliberate gesture that felt almost like a handshake, an agreement of some kind. I spent the rest of that morning making phone calls. I contacted the local animal shelters posted on Nextdoor and Facebook lost pet groups and called the number for the city's animal control. The dog, I'd started thinking of him as Cooper, though I had no idea why that name came to mind, stayed close to me throughout the process as if he understood that I was trying to help him get home. But as the day wore on and no one came forward, I began to wonder if maybe Cooper had been abandoned rather than lost. The thought made me angry. How could someone abandon such a clearly loving, intelligent animal? As evening approached, the rain intensified, and I couldn't bring myself to put Cooper back outside. I found an old blanket and made him a bed in the mudroom, with fresh water and another small meal of chicken. He settled onto the blanket gratefully, but his eyes never left me as I moved around the house. That night, I lay in bed listening to the rain and thinking about the strange turn my day had taken. I'd been living in careful isolation for months, speaking to neighbors only when necessary, ordering groceries online, working from my home office. I'd convinced myself that solitude was what I needed, that connections only led to disappointment and pain. But now there was this dog in my mudroom, this creature who had appeared out of nowhere and somehow made my house feel like a home for the first time since I'd moved in. Around midnight, I heard a soft whining from downstairs. I found Cooper standing by the mudroom door looking distressed. When he saw me, he wagged his tail hopefully. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked. He walked to the back door and looked at me expectantly. I led him out into the fenced yard, but instead of relieving himself as I'd expected, he went straight to the same spot where I'd first found him and began digging again. In the light from the porch, I could see that he'd made significant progress in the hole he'd started that morning. It was deep enough now that I could see he was digging with purpose, not just random scratching. Whatever he was looking for, he was convinced it was there. I stood in the doorway, rain misting against my face, watching this determined animal pursue his mysterious goal. Something about the sight stirred a memory I couldn't quite grasp, a feeling of recognition that didn't make sense. When Cooper finally came back inside, muddy and satisfied, I cleaned him up as best I could with an old towel. As I dried his paws, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small scar on his left front paw, shaped almost like a crescent moon. The scar was old, well-healed, but distinctive. Looking at that scar, I felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. But I shook off the feeling and got Cooper settled back on his blanket. Tomorrow I would continue trying to find his owner. Tomorrow, I would return this beautiful animal to wherever he belonged. I had no idea that tomorrow would change everything, or that the hole Cooper was digging would unearth far more than buried treasure. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes living in the Pacific Northwest feel like a privilege. I woke to find Cooper sitting beside my bed, tail wagging gently, as if he'd been waiting patiently for me to open my eyes. The sight made me smile, my first genuine smile in months. "Morning, buddy," I said, reaching out to pet his head. His fur had dried overnight into soft waves of gold and cream, and in the morning light streaming through my bedroom window, he was absolutely beautiful. After letting him out and feeding him more of the rotisserie chicken, I decided to take him for a walk around the neighborhood. Maybe someone would recognize him or we'd spot lost dog posters that I'd missed in yesterday's rain. I fashioned a makeshift leash from an old rope I found in my garage, and Cooper accepted it with the patient grace he seemed to bring to everything. Southeast Portland was perfect for walking. Tree-lined streets with character-rich houses, each one telling its own story through architectural details and garden choices. Cooper trotted beside me with obvious enjoyment, stopping to sniff interesting spots but never pulling or straining against the rope. His leash manners were impeccable, another sign that he'd been well-trained and loved. We'd gone about 6 blocks when Cooper suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears perked up and his entire body went rigid with attention. He was staring down a side street I'd never explored, his expression intense and focused. "What is it, boy?" I asked, following his gaze. The street was lined with older homes, many of them dating back to the 1920s and 30s. Most were well-maintained, with neat gardens and fresh paint. But at the end of the street, set back behind an overgrown hedge, I could see a house that stood out for all the wrong reasons. The paint was peeling, the roof had missing shingles, and the yard was a tangle of blackberry vines and neglected flower beds. Cooper began walking toward that house with such purpose that I had no choice but to follow. As we got closer, I could see that despite its current condition, it had once been beautiful. A charming Tudor-style home with leaded glass windows and a covered front porch that begged for rocking chairs and sweet tea conversations. Cooper led me right up to the front gate, which hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. He sat down and looked at me expectantly, as if we'd arrived at our intended destination. "This isn't your house, is it, buddy?" I asked, though something in my chest was beginning to flutter with an emotion I couldn't name. The mailbox at the gate was weathered and tilted, but I could still make out the numbers, 1247. And below that, in faded letters, a name that made my blood run cold. H. Morrison. Morrison was my mother's maiden name, my grandfather's name. I stared at the mailbox, my mind racing. My mother had mentioned once, years ago, during one of our rare phone conversations, that her father had moved to Portland after my grandmother died. But we'd lost touch with him completely after a bitter family fight when I was 12. I'd always assumed he'd died years ago. Cooper whined softly and pawed at the gate, clearly wanting to go into the yard. "No way," I whispered, more to myself than to the dog. "This can't be." But even as I said it, pieces were clicking into place. The scar on Cooper's paw, the way he'd appeared in my backyard, which backed up to the alley that ran behind this very street, the determined digging in the exact spot where someone might tunnel under a fence to escape a neglected yard. My grandfather, if this really was his house, had always been known for his love of dogs. Some of my earliest memories were of visiting his farm in rural Oregon, where he'd had a succession of golden retrievers that he'd trained with remarkable patience and skill. The memory I'd been struggling to grasp the night before suddenly crystallized. My grandfather teaching a young golden retriever to shake hands by placing its paw on his arm, exactly the gesture Cooper had made with me. With trembling hands, I opened the gate. Cooper immediately bounded up the overgrown path to the front porch, his tail wagging furiously. He reached the front door and began pawing at it, whining with what sounded like frustration and longing. I followed slowly, my heart pounding. The front windows were covered with heavy curtains, making it impossible to see inside. But there were signs of recent habitation. A newspaper from 2 days ago still in its plastic wrapper, and a small pile of mail that hadn't yet been rained on. Before I could lose my nerve, I knocked on the door. The sound seemed to echo through the house, and for a long moment there was nothing. Then I heard shuffling footsteps and the rattle of multiple locks being undone. The door opened to reveal a man I almost didn't recognize. My grandfather had always been tall and imposing, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. The man standing before me was still tall, but stooped with age. His hair was pure white and thin, and his clothes hung loose on his diminished frame. But his eyes, sharp blue and intelligent, were exactly as I remembered. He stared at me for a long moment, those piercing eyes taking in every detail of my face. Then his gaze dropped to Cooper, who was wiggling with excitement at our feet. "Duke," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You came home." The name hit me like a physical blow. Duke, not Cooper. Duke. My grandfather's voice carried 20 years of grief and longing as he reached down to pet the dog, who was now practically vibrating with joy. "Grandpa," I managed to whisper, managed to. His eyes snapped back to my face, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like a child again. "David? David Morrison Stevens." The fact that he remembered my hyphenated last name, the compromise my parents had reached when they married, nearly undid me. "Yes, sir, it's me." For a moment, neither of us moved. 20 years of silence stretched between us like a chasm. I thought of the last time I'd seen him at my grandmother's funeral, when angry words had been exchanged between him and my father. Words about duty and respect and family obligations that had seemed so important then and so petty now. "How did you find me?" he asked finally. I looked down at Duke, who was sitting between us, looking back and forth as if monitoring our conversation. "I didn't. He found me. Duke showed up in my backyard yesterday morning." My grandfather's expression softened as he looked at his dog. "He's been getting out. I can't figure out how. The yard is fenced, and I've checked it a dozen times." I thought of the hole Duke had been digging, the careful way he'd explored my fence line. "I live on Belmont, about 6 blocks from here. My backyard backs up to the alley behind your street." Understanding dawned in my grandfather's eyes. He's been tunneling under the fence. Looks like it. He spent both nights digging in the same spot. My grandfather was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then, to my surprise, he stepped back and opened the door wider. Would you like to come in? Both of you? The house was dark and cluttered, filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life lived alone. But underneath the dust and disorder, I could see traces of the warm, welcoming home it had once been. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, though I noticed they stopped abruptly around the time I would have been 12. Duke immediately made himself at home, trotting to a worn dog bed by the fireplace and settling down with a satisfied sigh. He's been gone since Tuesday, my grandfather said, watching his dog with obvious relief. I was starting to think he wasn't coming back this time. How old is he? I asked. 12. I got him as a puppy just after. He paused and I could fill in the blank. Just after our family had severed ties with him. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of 20 years of missed birthdays and holidays and life events pressing down on us. Then my grandfather cleared his throat. Would you like some coffee? It's not very good, but it's hot. I nodded, grateful for something to do with my hands. As he shuffled toward the kitchen, I noticed he moved carefully, favoring his left leg. Age had taken its toll, but there was still something dignified about the way he carried himself. The kitchen was cleaner than the living room, though sparse. A few dishes in the sink, a coffee maker that looked like it was older than I was, and a small table with one chair. The sight of that single chair hit me harder than it should have. How long have you been in Portland? I asked as he poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. 15 years, give or take. Moved here after I sold the farm. He handed me a mug, and our fingers briefly touched as I took it. His hands were gnarled with arthritis but still strong. Mom mentioned you'd moved, but we never knew where. His expression hardened slightly. Your mother made it clear that my presence wasn't welcome in your lives. The old anger flickered in his voice, and I felt the familiar defensive response rising in my chest. But then I looked at Duke, peaceful and content by the fireplace, and something shifted. Things were said, I replied carefully, by everyone. Things that maybe shouldn't have been said. He studied me over his coffee mug. You look like your father, he said finally, but you have your grandmother's eyes. The mention of my grandmother, his beloved wife of 47 years, seemed to soften something in his expression. I miss her, I said quietly. I miss a lot of things from before everything went wrong. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he looked up, there was something vulnerable in his expression that I'd never seen before. Duke has arthritis in his hips, he said suddenly. The vet says it's getting worse. Some days he can barely make it up the stairs. I wasn't sure why he was telling me this, but I sensed it was important. That's why I was so worried when he disappeared. He's not a young dog anymore. He shouldn't be wandering the neighborhood, sleeping outside. He paused, then added quietly, neither of us should be alone anymore. The implication hung in the air between us. As I sat in that cluttered kitchen looking at this man who had once been such an important part of my life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of family. Real family. Not the obligatory holiday phone calls and birthday cards, but the kind of deep, messy, complicated love that my grandmother had always insisted was worth fighting for. Duke wandered into the kitchen then, as if sensing the shift in our conversation. He came over to where I was sitting and rested his head on my knee again, just as he had the day before. He likes you, my grandfather observed. Duke doesn't trust easily. Hasn't since what? Since I got old and started disappointing him, he said with a sad smile. Dogs expect consistency. Walks at the same time every day, meals on schedule, attention and care. Lately, I haven't been very good at any of that. I looked down at Duke's trusting brown eyes and felt something crack open in my chest. Maybe, I said slowly, we could help each other out. My grandfather raised an eyebrow. How do you mean? I work from home. I've got a big yard that's going to waste. And honestly, I could use the company. I took a deep breath. Maybe Duke could spend some time at my place, give you a chance to rest, give him a chance to get proper exercise, and maybe we could start over. The silence stretched between us, but it felt different now, hopeful rather than awkward. I'd like that, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. I'd like that very much. As if he understood exactly what we'd agreed to, Duke's tail began to wag, sweeping across the kitchen floor with renewed energy. But even as we began to plan how this new arrangement might work, none of us could foresee the challenges that lay ahead. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised me with its ease. Every morning I would walk to my grandfather's house to pick up Duke for the day. Henry, I'd finally started calling him by his first name rather than Grandpa, which felt too presumptuous after 20 years, would have Duke ready with his favorite tennis ball and a thermos of coffee for me. Coffee's still terrible, he'd warn me each morning, but I'd learned he took pride in having it ready precisely at 8 a.m. Duke flourished with the increased attention and exercise. Our daily walks through southeast Portland became explorations of the neighborhood's hidden treasures. The community garden where Duke would chase butterflies, the food truck pods where friendly vendors began saving him bits of meat, the dog parks where he rediscovered his love of fetch despite his aging joints. But it was watching Henry through Duke's eyes that began to shift my perspective on our family's long-standing feud. The man I remembered as stern and unforgiving showed infinite patience with his aging dog. He'd prepare Duke's arthritis medication each morning with the care of a pharmacist. And I noticed he'd cut Duke's food into smaller pieces to make it easier to digest. He used to be able to catch a frisbee at a full run, Henry told me one afternoon as we watched Duke carefully navigate the steps to his front porch. Now I worry about him jumping off the couch wrong. The love in his voice was unmistakable, and it made me wonder what else I'd misunderstood about this man who'd seemed so harsh in my childhood memories. On a particularly beautiful Thursday morning in early November, Duke and I were walking through Laurelhurst Park when I encountered Mrs. Chen, an elderly Korean woman who fed the ducks every morning with military precision. "Your grandfather's dog is looking much better," she said without preamble, scattering breadcrumbs with practiced efficiency. I stopped short. "You know my grandfather?" "Henry Morrison." "Of course I know him. He's been bringing Duke here every morning for years." She gave me a sharp look. "Until recently, when he stopped coming." "He stopped coming?" "About 2 months ago. I was worried something had happened to him." She scattered more crumbs, then fixed me with a stern gaze. "That man loves his dog more than most people love their children. When he stopped bringing Duke for their morning walks, I knew something was wrong." The information hit me like a cold wave. Henry had been struggling longer than he'd let on, and Duke's escape attempts weren't random. They were a response to his routine being disrupted. "Is Henry okay?" Mrs. Chen asked. "He looked very tired the last time I saw him." I realized I didn't actually know. We'd fallen into this comfortable routine of dog sharing, but I'd been careful not to pry too deeply into Henry's life. We talked about safe topics: Duke's health, neighborhood news, memories of my grandmother's cooking, but I'd avoided asking the harder questions about his well-being, his health, his loneliness. That afternoon, instead of simply dropping Duke off and leaving, I lingered on Henry's front porch. "Mrs. Chen at the park says you used to bring Duke there every morning," I said casually. Henry's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Used to?" "Yes. She was worried about you when you stopped coming." "I'm fine," he said quickly, too quickly. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in weeks. His clothes were clean but too loose, suggesting weight loss. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he gripped the porch railing as he stood, as if he needed the support. "Henry," I said gently, "when's the last time you saw a doctor?" "I don't need a doctor. I'm just tired." But Duke, who had been listening to our conversation with that uncanny awareness dogs possess, walked over to Henry and sat directly on his feet. A behavior I'd learned meant he was worried about his person. "Duke thinks you need a doctor," I observed. Henry looked down at his dog, and for a moment his careful composure cracked. "Smart dog. Will you let me take you? Just for a checkup?" The silence stretched between us. I could see him weighing his independence against his growing exhaustion, his pride against his practical needs. "I haven't been sleeping well," he admitted finally. "Haven't been eating much either. Everything tastes like cardboard." "How long has this been going on?" "Since summer, I suppose, maybe longer." He sat down heavily in the old rocking chair on his porch. "Duke used to wake me up at dawn demanding his walk, but I started sleeping through his signals. Then I'd feel guilty about disappointing him, so I'd sleep worse the next night. It became a cycle." I sat down on the porch steps, Duke immediately positioning himself between us like a furry diplomat. "Depression?" I asked quietly. Henry was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother used to say I was like a tree, rooted deep, but dependent on the right conditions to thrive." He reached down to stroke Duke's head. When she died, I thought I could just keep going through the motions, move somewhere new, start fresh. But trees can't just transplant themselves and expect to flourish. The vulnerability in his admission took my breath away. This was the man I'd remembered as unshakable, who'd seemed to have opinions carved in stone about everything from politics to proper lawn maintenance. What about medication? Therapy? I'm 83 years old, he said, with a trace of his old stubbornness. I'm not going to start taking pills to make me pretend everything's fine. Henry, I said carefully, depression isn't about pretending. It's about getting your brain chemistry back in balance so you can start living again instead of just surviving. He studied me with those sharp blue eyes. You sound like you speak from experience. I hadn't intended to share my own struggles, but something about his honesty demanded equal vulnerability in return. I've been taking antidepressants for 6 months, I admitted, since my divorce. Since I realized I'd been going through the motions of my life instead of actually living it. And they help. They help enough that I can get out of bed, exercise, take care of a dog that wandered into my yard. I smiled at Duke, who was watching our conversation with intense interest. They help enough that I could remember what it felt like to care about another living creature. Henry was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. I should have reached out, he said finally, when your marriage ended. Your mother mentioned it during one of our rare phone calls, but I thought you probably wouldn't want to hear from me. Mom talks to you? Once or twice a year, usually around your grandmother's birthday. He rocked slowly in his chair. She asks about my health, tells me about your sister's kids, mentions how you're doing in general terms. But there's always this wall between us, this careful politeness that never addresses the elephant in the room. What elephant? The fact that I was wrong, he said simply. 20 years ago, when your father and I had that fight at the funeral, I was wrong, and too proud to admit it. The words hung in the air between us. I'd carried the anger and hurt from that day for 2 decades, letting it color my perception of family loyalty and forgiveness. My father had wanted to give a eulogy that included stories of my grandmother's struggles with alcohol in her younger years. He thought it would show her strength in overcoming addiction. Henry had been furious, insisting that such personal details had no place in a public memorial. The argument had escalated until harsh words were exchanged about respect and family honor, ending with Henry telling my father he was no longer welcome in his life. An edict that had, by extension, included my mother, my sister, and me. Dad was trying to honor her complexity, I said quietly, to show that she'd overcome real struggles. I know that now, Henry replied. But at the time, all I could hear was someone wanting to air our private pain in public. I was grieving and angry and... He paused, struggling with the words. I was terrified that people would think less of her, think less of our marriage, think that her drinking meant I'd failed as a husband. For the first time, I understood the fear behind his anger. He hadn't been protecting family reputation as much as protecting his own sense of worth as a partner who'd loved her through everything. She would have understood Dad's impulse, I said. Grandma was never ashamed of her past. No, she wasn't. She was braver than I was about most things. He looked at Duke, who had settled down with his head across both our feet, including the importance of family forgiveness. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon light filter through the maple trees in his front yard. Duke dozed between us, his steady breathing a soothing counterpoint to the weight of our conversation. I'll make an appointment with my doctor, Henry said finally. If you'll come with me. Of course. And David? He used my name deliberately, something he hadn't done since I was a child. Thank you for bringing Duke home to me every day, for giving an old man a reason to get up in the morning again. Thank you for trusting me with him. As I walked home that evening, I felt something shifting in my chest, a loosening of knots I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten they were there. Duke had done more than tunnel under a fence. He'd tunneled under 20 years of stubborn pride and wounded feelings, creating a pathway for something I'd never expected to find again. Family. But I couldn't shake the feeling that our tentative reconciliation was still fragile, built on a foundation that would soon be tested in ways none of us were prepared for. Dr. Martinez delivered the news with the kind of gentle directness that told me she'd had this conversation many times before. Henry sat in the examination chair, still buttoned into his flannel shirt, his hands folded carefully in his lap. I sat in the corner chair, there as much for my support as his, watching my grandfather's face for signs of how he was processing what we'd just heard. The good news, Dr. Martinez continued, is that we caught it early. The mass in your lung is small, and the blood work suggests it hasn't spread, but we'll need to do more comprehensive imaging to be certain. Lung cancer. The words seemed to echo in the small examination room, reshaping everything about our carefully constructed new normal. What are we talking about in terms of treatment? I asked when Henry remained silent. That depends on the staging, but likely surgery followed by chemotherapy. At your age, Mr. Morrison, we'd want to be aggressive but thoughtful about the approach. Henry spoke for the first time since she'd shared the diagnosis. How long do I have? If I do nothing? Henry, I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. How long? He repeated to Dr. Martinez. Without treatment? It's hard to say. Maybe 6 months to a year, but that's just an estimate. And with treatment? If we can remove it surgically and the chemo is effective, you could have many good years ahead of you. Henry nodded slowly, as if filing away information for later consideration. I need to think about this. Doctor. Martinez gave him a business card with the oncology scheduler's number and instructions for the additional scans, then left us alone in the room that suddenly felt too small and too bright. Henry, I said gently, you heard what she said. If they caught it early. I heard what she said. His voice was steady but distant. I also know what chemotherapy does to a person. I watched your grandmother go through it. The memory hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother's cancer had been much more advanced when they found it, and the treatment had been brutal and ultimately unsuccessful. She'd spent her final months weak and nauseous, a shadow of the vibrant woman who'd taught me to bake cookies and identify wildflowers. That was 15 years ago, I said. Treatment has improved. Has it? Or do doctors just get better at giving false hope? We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of mortality settling between us like an unwelcome visitor. What about Duke? I asked quietly. Henry's composure cracked slightly at the mention of his dog. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. When we pulled up to Henry's house, Duke was waiting on the front porch as if he'd sensed something was wrong. He trotted down to meet us, tail wagging but subdued, his intelligent eyes moving between our faces as if reading our mood. He knows, Henry said, reaching down to scratch behind Duke's ears. Dogs always know. That evening, I called my mother for the first time in 6 months. The conversation was awkward at first. 20 years of strained family dynamics don't disappear overnight. But when I told her about Henry's diagnosis, something shifted. How is he handling it? She asked, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. About like you'd expect. He's considering not treating it at all. That sounds like Dad. There was a pause then. David, I know things have been complicated between us all, but if something happens to him, I don't want there to be regrets. Are you thinking of coming out here? I don't know if he'd want to see me. Why don't you ask him? Another pause. Would you ask him for me? Feel out whether he'd be open to a visit. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about family and forgiveness and the strange way crisis can clarify what really matters. Through my back window, I could see the spot where Duke had first appeared, digging frantically in my garden. In just a few weeks, that determined digging had unearthed not buried treasure, but something more valuable, the possibility of healing relationships I'd written off as permanently broken. The next morning, I found Henry in his backyard with Duke, sitting in a rusty lawn chair and throwing a tennis ball half-heartedly, while Duke retrieved it with diminished enthusiasm. Both of them seemed to be going through the motions of their normal routine while thinking about bigger questions. My mom wants to come visit, I said without preamble. Henry caught the tennis ball and held it, studying the worn yellow surface. Does she now? She's worried about you. They both are. Both? Mom and Dad? Apparently Mom has been giving him updates on our conversations. Henry was quiet for a long moment, absently petting Duke, who had given up on the ball game and was leaning against his legs. Your father wrote me a letter, he said finally. About 3 years ago. I never responded to it. This was news to me. What did it say? That he was sorry. That the things we fought about at your grandmother's funeral weren't worth losing family over. That he'd always respected how much I loved her. And he hoped I could forgive him for handling her memorial poorly. Why didn't you respond? Pride, mostly. And fear, if I'm being honest. Fear of what? Fear that too much time had passed. That we'd all moved on and established lives that didn't include each other. He looked at me with those sharp blue eyes. Fear that reaching out would just confirm that some bridges can't be rebuilt. Duke, sensing the emotional weight of our conversation, moved to position himself between us in his characteristic mediator pose. This dog, Henry said, looking down at him fondly. Has been trying to tell me something for months. All those escape attempts, all that digging. I thought he was just getting senile, losing his ability to stay in the yard. What do you think he was trying to tell you? That isolation isn't living. That family is worth fighting for. That sometimes you have to dig deep and tunnel under the barriers people have built to get to the good stuff underneath. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. So what do we do now? Now. Henry stood up slowly, Duke immediately moving to support him. Now I make some phone calls. To your mother, to your father, to the oncology scheduler. He paused, then added with a slight smile. And I probably should call Mrs. Chen and tell her Duke will be back at the park soon. She's been asking about us. The first call was to my mother, and I listened from the kitchen as Henry spoke to his daughter for the first time in months, without the careful politeness that had characterized their recent conversations. Barbara, it's Dad. David told me you might want to visit. His voice was steady but warm. I think I'd like that very much. I could hear my mother's voice through the phone, though not her words, but the tone was emotional and relieved. Yes, I'm okay. Well, not entirely okay, but we'll talk about that when you get here. A pause. And Barbara? Tell James his letter meant a lot to me. I should have responded years ago. When he hung up, Henry looked older but also somehow lighter, as if a weight he'd been carrying had been redistributed. They're driving up this weekend, he told me. Your mother wants to help me organize this house before I start treatment, and your father wants to take Duke fishing. Apparently he's never forgotten that Duke's great-grandfather was the best duck dog he'd ever seen. You're going to do the treatment? I'm going to fight, he said firmly. I've got things to live for now. A dog who needs his walks, a grandson who makes terrible coffee but shows up every day anyway, and apparently, a family that's willing to forgive a stubborn old man his mistakes. That afternoon, as I watched Henry schedule his CT scan and surgical consultation, I marveled at the chain of events that had brought us to this point. A dog's determination to tunnel under a fence had not only reunited us, but had also given Henry a reason to fight for his life. But as I looked at Duke, sleeping peacefully in his bed by the fireplace, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with a different kind of worry. His breathing seemed slightly labored, and when he shifted position, he moved with obvious stiffness that seemed worse than usual. The thought that struck me was almost too painful to consider. What if in fighting for Henry's life we were running out of time with Duke? The irony was cruel. The dog who had brought us together might not be with us long enough to see the family he'd worked so hard to reunite. It was Duke who made the decision for us in the way that dogs do, with quiet dignity and an uncanny sense of timing. Henry's surgery had been scheduled for the following Tuesday, and my parents had arrived on Friday evening. The reunion was emotional but carefully choreographed, with Duke serving as both buffer and icebreaker. My father, who I hadn't seen in 2 years, spent his first evening back in Henry's life teaching Duke a new trick, while my mother bustled around the kitchen making Henry's favorite soup. But over the weekend, Duke's decline became impossible to ignore. He'd stopped eating his regular food, choosing only small bits of chicken when coaxed. His breathing grew more labored, and several times I caught him standing in the middle of a room, looking confused, as if he'd forgotten where he was going. Sunday morning, I found him collapsed in Henry's hallway, unable to get back on his feet. The emergency vet's diagnosis was swift and heartbreaking. Duke's kidneys were failing, and there were signs that cancer had spread throughout his body. At 12 years old, with advanced arthritis and now organ failure, his body was simply shutting down. We can try aggressive treatment, Dr. Kim explained gently, but I have to be honest, he's very sick. Treatment would involve multiple hospitalizations, and there's no guarantee it would extend his life significantly. Henry sat in the examination room, holding Duke's head in his lap, while my parents and I clustered around them. Duke's eyes were still alert and loving, but his body was clearly failing him. What's the alternative? Henry asked quietly. We can keep him comfortable with pain medication and let him pass naturally, or... Dr. Kim paused. We can help him go peacefully, before the pain becomes too much. The silence in the room was deafening. Duke seemed to sense the gravity of the conversation because he lifted his head slightly and looked directly at Henry, then at each of us in turn, as if saying goodbye. How long does he have naturally? My mother asked. It's hard to say. Maybe a few days, maybe a week. But he'll likely be uncomfortable, and he may become distressed as his organs continue to fail. Henry was quiet for a long time, his hands gentle on Duke's fur. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady despite the tears in his eyes. Duke's been trying to tell me something for months. When he kept escaping, when he led David to my house, when he insisted on bringing us all together. He looked at each of us. He was making sure I wouldn't be alone, that our family would be okay. Henry, my father said softly, speaking to him directly for the first time since they'd reunited. Whatever you decide will support you. I think, Henry said slowly, Duke has earned the right to leave on his own terms, with dignity, surrounded by people who love him, before pain takes away everything that makes him himself. Dr. Kim nodded with compassionate understanding. Would you like some time alone with him? You can take as long as you need. She left us in the examination room, and for the next hour, we said goodbye to the dog who had given us back our family. My mother told Duke stories about my grandmother, how much she would have loved him. My father thanked him for taking such good care of Henry all these years. I told him about that first morning in my backyard, how his trust had taught me to trust again. But it was Henry's goodbye that broke all our hearts. Thank you, buddy, he whispered, his face pressed against Duke's head. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for teaching me that family is worth digging for. Thank you for making sure I wouldn't be alone when you were gone. Duke's tail wagged weakly, one last time. When Dr. Kim returned, Duke was resting peacefully in Henry's arms. The injection was quick and gentle, and Duke simply closed his eyes and took a last, quiet breath. We sat with him for a while after, none of us ready to leave. Finally, Dr. Kim asked if we wanted to take him home for burial or if we preferred cremation. Home, Henry said without hesitation. He needs to come home. That afternoon, we buried Duke in Henry's backyard, in the flower bed where my grandmother's roses had once bloomed. My father, who had worked construction before retiring, helped Henry and me dig the grave while my mother gathered wildflowers from the overgrown garden. As we stood around the small mound of earth, Henry spoke without prompting. Duke taught me that love isn't something you earn or lose, he said. It's something you choose every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He looked at each of us. I chose wrong 20 years ago, letting pride matter more than family. But Duke didn't give up on me, and somehow he made sure you didn't either. My mother was crying openly, and my father had his arm around her shoulders. I realized it was the first time I'd seen them together in Henry's presence since my grandmother's funeral. The surgery, my mother said through her tears. Are you still going to? Tuesday morning, 8 a.m., Henry confirmed. Duke made sure I'd have something to fight for. I'm not going to waste his gift. That evening, we ordered pizza and sat around Henry's kitchen table, sharing stories about Duke and slowly, carefully, beginning to rebuild the connections that had been broken for too long. My parents shared updates about my sister's family, and Henry told stories about Duke's puppyhood that had us laughing through our tears. But it was the quiet moments that mattered most. My father helping Henry sort through his medications, my mother quietly organizing his pantry, the way we all naturally included Duke in our conversation as if he were still there. You know, my father said as we were cleaning up, I think Duke knew exactly what he was doing when he led David to your house. How do you mean? Henry asked. He was 12 years old, declining health, and he could have spent his final months quietly fading away. Instead, he used the energy he had left to make sure his family was taken care of. My father's voice was thick with emotion. That's not instinct. That's love. As my parents settled into the guest room they'd prepared, and I gathered my things to head home, Henry walked me to the front door. David, he said, I want you to know that these past few weeks getting to know you again, watching you care for Duke, it's been one of the best gifts of my life. Even under the circumstances, especially under the circumstances. Duke didn't just bring us together. He reminded us what we're capable of when we stop protecting ourselves and start protecting each other. That night, I lay in my own bed thinking about love and loss, and the strange mathematics of grief. We'd lost Duke, but in losing him we'd found each other again. His absence was a hole in all our hearts, but it was also a space where our renewed connections could grow. On Tuesday morning, as we sat in the pre-op waiting room while Henry underwent surgery to remove the cancer from his lung, I found myself thinking about Duke's legacy. He'd spent his final months teaching us that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up, day after day, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable or scary. The surgery was successful. Dr. Martinez emerged 4 hours later with news that they'd removed the entire tumor with clear margins. Henry would need chemotherapy, but his prognosis was excellent. As we celebrated quietly in his recovery room, I felt Duke's presence in the way my father automatically took charge of coordinating Henry's care schedule. in the way my mother had already researched the best nutritional support during chemo, in the way Henry reached for each of our hands as he drifted in and out of sleep. We were a family again, imperfect and healing, held together by the memory of a dog who had refused to let us stay broken. 3 months after Duke's death, Henry's garden was beginning to show signs of life again. The chemotherapy had been rough, weeks of nausea and fatigue that left him weak and discouraged, but his latest scans showed no signs of remaining cancer. More importantly, he was beginning to resemble the man I remembered from my childhood, opinionated, stubborn, but fundamentally warm. My parents had extended their visit indefinitely, moving into a small apartment nearby so they could help with Henry's care without overwhelming him. The adjustment period had been bumpy. Too many cooks in the kitchen, too many opinions about the right way to organize medications, but gradually, we'd found our rhythm as a family. I was pruning the overgrown roses near Duke's grave when Henry joined me in the garden, moving slowly but steadily. His hair was growing back in white tufts, and he'd regained some of the weight he'd lost during treatment. "Those are Mr. Lincoln roses," he said, watching me work. "Your grandmother's favorite, red as fresh blood when they bloom properly. Will they bloom again? They've been neglected for so long. Roses are tougher than they look. Cut them back hard enough, give them what they need, and they'll surprise you." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the spring air warm on our faces. It felt good to be doing something productive with our hands, something that would create beauty rather than just maintaining what already existed. "I've been thinking about getting another dog," Henry said suddenly. I looked up from the rose bush I was pruning. "Really? Not to replace Duke? You can't replace 12 years of history, but this house feels too quiet without paws on the floor. What kind of dog? Older, from a shelter, one that needs a second chance." He paused in his weeding. "Duke was a puppy when I got him, full of energy and potential. But I think now I'd prefer a dog that's already figured out what matters in life." The symbolism wasn't lost on me. We were all learning to appreciate the value of second chances. "Have you mentioned this to Mom and Dad?" "Your father's the one who suggested it. Says an older dog would be good company for an older man and less likely to run me ragged." The fact that Henry and my father were not only speaking regularly, but actually planning together still felt miraculous. Their relationship would never be exactly what it had been before the 20-year rift, but it was becoming something new and solid. "Mrs. Chen has been asking about you," I said. "She wants to know when you'll be back at the park for the morning duck feeding." "Soon, Doctor. Martinez says I can start taking longer walks next week." He sat back on his heels, studying the garden bed we'd been working on. "David, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." "Okay. How are you doing? Really doing? With Duke gone, with all the family drama, with having your grandfather back in your life after 20 years? It was a harder question than it sounded. The past few months had been an emotional roller coaster. Joy at our reconciliation, grief over Duke's death, anxiety about Henry's health, complicated feelings about my parents being part of my daily life again. "I'm better than I was 6 months ago," I said finally. "Not healed, but healing." "Good. Because I want to tell you something Duke couldn't." Henry's voice grew serious. "You saved my life. Not just by bringing Duke home that first day, but by showing up every morning after. By making me remember what it felt like to be needed, to be part of something bigger than my own loneliness." "Henry, let me finish. Depression is a liar, David. It tells you that isolation is safety, that disconnection is protection. Duke knew better, and somehow he made sure you found me before I gave up completely." I felt tears prick my eyes. "You would have been fine without me." "No, I wouldn't have. I was disappearing a little more each day, becoming a ghost in my own life. Duke saw it happening and did the only thing he could. He brought me family." We sat in the garden, surrounded by the green shoots of spring growth, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not closure exactly, but acceptance. Duke was gone, but his influence lived on in every interaction between us, every choice to show up for each other, every decision to love despite the risk of loss. "There's something else," Henry said. "I've been talking to your mother about this house. It's too big for me alone and the maintenance is becoming overwhelming." My heart sank. "Are you selling?" "I'm thinking about it, but I wanted to run an idea by you first." He gestured toward the house. "What if we turned it into something that could house all of us? Not permanently, but as a home base. Your parents could have the main floor. I could take the smaller bedroom upstairs and we could convert the basement into an apartment for you, if you wanted. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. You want us all to live together? I want us to be family again, real family. The kind that has Sunday dinners and helps each other with groceries and argues about politics over coffee. He smiled. The kind that Duke always knew we could be. That's a lot of togetherness. What if we drive each other crazy? Then we'll figure it out. That's what families do. That evening, I found myself standing in my own backyard looking at the spot where Duke had first appeared. The hole he'd dug had long since been filled in, but I could still see the slightly different texture of the soil where his determined digging had broken through the hard-packed earth. My phone rang. My sister calling from Colorado, where she lived with her husband and twin daughters. Mom told me about the house idea, she said without preamble. Are you going to do it? I don't know. It's a big change. Good change, though. David, I've been thinking about what happened to our family, and I think we all made the same mistake. What mistake? We thought love was supposed to be easy, that if it required work or forgiveness or second chances, it wasn't real love. Her voice grew thoughtful. But Duke didn't love Henry because it was easy. He loved him because Henry needed love. And then he made sure Henry had human family who could love him the same way. After we hung up, I walked to my back fence and looked through the gap where Duke had tunneled between our yards. The hole had been repaired, but I could still see where he'd worn a path in the grass from his repeated journeys. A dog's determination to connect had changed all our lives. Not through any grand gesture or dramatic intervention, but through the simple, stubborn insistence that family was worth fighting for. The next morning, I called Henry with my answer. I'm in, I said. On one condition. What's that? When we get your new dog, we let him choose his own name. No more human assumptions about what dogs should be called. Henry's laugh was rich and warm. Deal. Duke would have approved. As spring turned to summer, we began the process of renovating Henry's house to accommodate our unconventional family arrangement. My parents threw themselves into the project with enthusiasm, my father handling the construction work while my mother planned the kitchen renovation that would serve as the heart of our shared home. And on a warm day in July, exactly 1 year after Duke had first appeared in my backyard, Henry and I drove to the county animal shelter to meet a 7-year-old Labrador mix who'd been surrendered when his elderly owner could no longer care for him. The dog was calm and dignified, with graying whiskers and intelligent brown eyes that reminded me immediately of Duke. But where Duke had been golden and eager, this dog was black and thoughtful, content to sit quietly and observe before making decisions. What do you think? I asked Henry as the dog leaned gently against his legs. I think, Henry said, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. He looks like he's got stories to tell. The dog's tail wagged slowly, and something in his expression suggested he was ready to start a new chapter. We brought him home that afternoon, and he settled into Duke's old bed by the fireplace as if he'd always belonged there. That evening, as our family gathered for dinner in Henry's kitchen, soon to be our kitchen, the dog padded over to each of us in turn, resting his head briefly on our knees in a gesture of introduction and acceptance. He's choosing his place in the pack, my father observed with a smile. So are we all, Henry replied, looking around the table at the family Duke had worked so hard to reunite. But even as we celebrated new beginnings, I knew our story was far from over. Healing is never a straight line, and families are living things that require constant tending. The lessons Duke had taught us about persistence and love would be tested again, in ways we couldn't yet imagine. 2 years later, I stood in the same garden where we'd buried Duke, watching Henry teach our new dog, who'd eventually chosen the name Scout by consistently responding only to that particular word, how to gentle-mouth the tennis balls that had once been Duke's favorite toys. The garden had been transformed through our collective efforts into something that would have made my grandmother proud. The Mr. Lincoln roses bloomed in spectacular red clusters, and we'd added beds of lavender and herbs that filled the air with fragrance. Duke's grave was marked now with a simple stone that read, Duke Morrison, Teacher of Love, and was surrounded by his favorite flowers. Scout was everything Duke hadn't been, measured where Duke had been enthusiastic, thoughtful where Duke had been impulsive, but he'd brought his own gifts to our family. His calm presence had been especially valuable during Henry's final round of chemotherapy, and his intuitive understanding of each family member's moods made him an exceptional therapy dog without any formal training. The house renovation had been completed 6 months earlier, and we'd all settled into a rhythm that surprised us with its comfort. My parents had the main floor with their own entrance. Henry had claimed the upstairs suite with its view of the garden, and I'd made the basement apartment into a cozy retreat that served as both home office and private sanctuary. It hadn't always been easy. There had been arguments about grocery shopping, too many different preferences, conflicts over television choices, news versus cooking shows versus sports, and debates about everything from thermostat settings to lawn mowing schedules. But we'd learned to navigate disagreements without abandoning each other, to fight fairly and forgive quickly. "David," Henry called from where he was working with Scout, "come settle an argument for us." I walked over to find my father and Henry engaged in what had become their favorite type of debate: how best to train a dog to perform some specific trick or behavior. Today's disagreement was about the proper technique for teaching Scout to close doors behind him. "Your father thinks Scout is too old to learn complex commands," Henry said with mock irritation. "I maintain that intelligence doesn't decline with age if you keep challenging it." "Are we talking about Scout or about you?" I asked with a grin. "Both, probably," my father admitted. Though I noticed Scout learned the door trick in 2 days while it took me a week to figure out how to use the new coffee maker. Scout, as if understanding he was the subject of discussion, performed the door-closing trick flawlessly, then sat waiting for praise with the patient dignity that characterized everything he did. My mother emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of lemonade and cookies, followed by my sister and her family, who were visiting for the weekend. The twins, now 8 years old, had become Scout's devoted companions, and he supervised their activities with the serious attention of a guardian. "Uncle David," my niece Emma called out, "Scout wants to show you something." Scout had indeed learned to show things, leading people to specific locations when he wanted their attention. Today, he led me to the back corner of the garden, where we'd recently planted a small orchard of fruit trees. He sat down next to the apple tree and looked at me expectantly. "What is it, buddy?" I asked, kneeling down next to him. He pawed gently at the base of the tree, and I noticed something I'd missed before: a small depression in the soil, as if something had been digging there. My heart skipped a beat. "Henry," I called, trying to keep my voice casual, "could you come over here for a minute?" Henry joined us, took one look at the disturbed soil and smiled. "So that's what he's been up to." "What do you mean?" "Scout's been coming out here after his evening walks, always to this same spot. I thought he was just exploring, but—" Henry knelt down and brushed away some of the loose dirt, revealing the corner of something metallic. Together, we carefully excavated what turned out to be a small metal box, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in several layers of plastic. It was old, but well preserved, and when we opened it, we found treasures that took my breath away. Inside were dozens of photographs, pictures of my grandparents when they were young, photos of my mother and uncle as children, and several pictures of dogs that had clearly been beloved family pets over the decades. At the bottom of the box was a leather journal tied with a faded ribbon. "Your grandmother's time capsule," Henry said softly. "She buried this the year before she died. Said she wanted to leave something for future generations to find." I opened the journal carefully, and my grandmother's familiar handwriting filled the pages. The first entry was dated just months before her death. "To whoever finds this, probably one of my stubborn men knowing them, I want you to know that love is the only thing that matters. Not the arguments we have or the mistakes we make, but the love that brings us back together again and again." The dogs in these pictures understood this better than any of us humans ever did. They loved without condition, forgave without reservation, and never let pride stand in the way of affection. I read the entry aloud to the family gathered around us, my voice breaking slightly as I continued. "Henry will try to carry the world on his shoulders after I'm gone. David will think he has to earn love through perfect behavior. Barbara will try to fix everyone else's problems instead of accepting help with her own. James will retreat into work, rather than risk being vulnerable. But I'm hoping that someday, they'll remember what the dogs always knew. That family is not about being perfect. It's about showing up again and again, especially when it's hard." There were more entries, stories about each family member, hopes for future grandchildren, and detailed instructions for caring for the rose garden. But it was the final entry that made us all cry. "I'm leaving this here in the garden because I know that sooner or later, love will bring you all back together. Maybe it will be a shared crisis, maybe a moment of celebration, or maybe just the everyday need for family that brings you home. But when you find this, I want you to know that every day I was blessed to love you was a gift. Take care of each other. Take care of the garden. And always, always remember that second chances are the most beautiful kind of grace. Scout sat patiently while we read and cried and hugged each other in the fading afternoon light. When my mother finally composed herself enough to speak, she looked at Scout with something approaching awe. "How did he know?" she asked. "How did he know exactly where to dig?" "Dogs know things," Henry said simply. Duke knew we needed each other. Scout knew we needed to find this. As the evening wore on and my sister's family prepared to head back to their hotel, we sat around the kitchen table looking through the photographs and sharing stories prompted by my grandmother's journal entries. Scout dozed by the fireplace, occasionally opening one eye to check on his people. "I have something to tell you all," Henry said as we were putting the photos away. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and finding this today seems like the right moment." We all looked at him expectantly. "I want to start a scholarship fund," he said, "in Duke's name, for kids who want to study veterinary medicine but can't afford it." "Henry, that's beautiful," my mother said. "I've been researching it with Dr. Martinez's help. We could partner with the local veterinary schools, maybe even set up internships at animal shelters." His eyes grew bright with enthusiasm. "Duke taught us that healing relationships is just as important as healing bodies. I want to support people who understand that." My father nodded approvingly. "What would you need from us?" "Help with the paperwork, mostly. And maybe, if you're willing, we could make it a family foundation, something we all contribute to and manage together." The idea felt perfect, a way to honor Duke's memory while creating something positive for future generations. "I'm in," I said immediately. "Me too," my parents said in unison. "We could include Scout," my niece Emma suggested seriously. "He could visit the students and help them practice being gentle with animals." Scout's tail thumped against the floor as if he approved of this plan. As I drove home to my basement apartment that night, a 5-minute walk through the garden that had become our family's evening ritual, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 2 years ago, I'd been living in isolation, convinced that solitude was safer than connection. Now I was part of a complex, sometimes chaotic, utterly loving family unit that included parents I'd reconciled with, a grandfather I'd rediscovered, and 2 dogs who'd taught us more about loyalty and persistence than any human teacher ever could. Duke's lesson had been about the courage to dig deep, to tunnel under barriers, to refuse to accept that broken connections couldn't be repaired. Scout's lesson was about patience, about the wisdom that comes with age, about the quiet strength found in simply being present for the people you love. Looking back at the house where lights glowed in each level, my parents reading in their living room, Henry probably organizing his medications upstairs, Scout likely making his final rounds to check on everyone, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. The hole Duke had dug in my backyard 2 years ago had been filled in long ago, but its purpose had been fulfilled. He'd found what he was looking for. Not buried treasure, but buried love, buried connection, buried hope that could be excavated and restored to life. And now, every morning when I let Scout out for his garden patrol, and every evening when our family gathered for dinner, I'm reminded that some bonds are strong enough to survive decades of neglect, some love is patient enough to wait for recognition, and some determined digging can unearth miracles. Duke wasn't just a lost animal who wandered into my yard. He was a messenger, a teacher, a bridge between past and future. He was the reminder that family is not something you're born into once, but something you choose to create again and again, through daily acts of showing up, forgiving, and loving without reservation. In the end, that's what he taught us all, that the most important treasures are often buried just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to dig, patient enough to excavate, and wise enough to recognize that what you uncover might change everything. Some bonds really are forever faithful, even when we forget to tend them. Sometimes all it takes is one determined soul, whether human or canine, to remind us that love, like the roses in my grandmother's garden, can bloom again if we're willing to do the work of healing. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that work is rewarded not just with reconciliation, but with the kind of deep, abiding family connection that can weather any storm, heal any wound, and transform any lonely house into a true home. Duke showed us the way. Scout is helping us walk the path. And together, we're building something that will last long after we're gone, a legacy of love that even time cannot diminish. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and their faithful companions. Subscribe to Pause That Marked Me for more stories that celebrate the transformative power of the human-animal connection.